Welcome to Codex History of Video Games. I'm Mike Coletta.
And I'm Tyler Osby.
And today we're doing Persona 2 Eternal Punishment.
Yeah, Persona 2 Part 2. Not Persona 3, but Persona 2 2.
Because there's two Persona 2s.
Yes. They were doing the sequel thing to the mainline series stuff way before Final Fantasy ever did Final Fantasy X 2. We got Persona 2 2.
I love that for them. I love that. And we're going to get into some real video game storylines here today. Not quite like Hitler showing up, but still pretty video game storyline-y. Okay, I'm excited.
It's not quite as like unhinged as Innocent Sin, but it is still pretty unhinged. I'm not going to like super detail it because I do think it is worth playing and I don't want to like spoiler it. I've also will probably get details wrong that don't matter here. So let's like talk about where we've been here. So far we've covered the first Persona game, Revelations Persona. It's called Revelations because that's what Atlas was going to call the Shin Megami Tensei series outside of Japan for a little while. There were a couple of games released under that. I think Revelations Persona, there was like a Game Boy game that got released also. I do kind of like that title, but I think calling it Shin Megami Tensei stays more true to the Japanese roots of the series, which is something that's super important to this game, to every Persona game after the first one. The first one in North America, they really they did not want it to seem Japanese. We're also going to be coming at this from a North American lens because there's some big differences, not just in translations, but also like in the availability of these games. So I'll speak to it from our perspective, I suppose. So that's like the angle that we're coming at it here. After the first Persona game, we got a second game called Persona 2 Innocent Sin. Well, the one that we're going to talk about is Eternal Punishment. You may ask, what are we being eternally punished for? It is the innocent sin of Persona 2 1, Persona 2 Innocent Sin. And that game never made it outside of Japan until 2011.
I love watching you explain this. It's just the sequels to the sequels. And just,
the sequels to sequels that didn't exist until like more recently in North America, or at least outside of Japan. So it's just like the stories go off the rails, but also we never had a chance over here. You know, even if they didn't go off the rails, we still didn't have the context necessary. I
love this kind of thing so much, though. Like this is the most video game kind of thing, and I'm excited.
Yeah, up until about 2011 when Innocent Sin came out in the PSP form on in a remake, we only had a recap of its story in like 2 pages of the Persona 2 Eternal Punishment manual. That's it, like the only thing that North American gamers knew about Persona 2 Innocent Sin. So we covered a lot of that in the last Persona episode, so I don't need to necessarily rehash it. But if you are just jumping in here, it is important to know that people who are playing Persona 2 Eternal Punishment in the year 2000 did not have all of the context that they needed to really understand that story. And even if they had that context, it still doesn't make a lot of sense.
It doesn't make sense.
So let's talk about the grime facts for Persona 2 Eternal Punishment.
Ooh, it's my favorite thing.
Yeah. Developed by Atlas. They also published it. It released on June 29th, 2000 in Japan and December 22nd, 2000 in North America, which is not a bad turnaround, to be honest. About 6 months.
That's really good, I feel like, especially for like international release in the 2000s. That's really good.
Yeah, and you know, the alternative probably was just not getting it at all, which we all know they do that. So let's see. Systems, including the best way to play this game. So for Eternal Punishment, it came out on the PlayStation 1, and then it got a PSP remake. But that PSP remake only came out in Japan. So if you're wanting to play the Persona 2 duology in the best way possible, you have to play the PSP version of Innocent Sin, but then the PlayStation 1 version of Eternal Punishment, unless you're willing to go down the fan translation rabbit hole and patch your PSP, like patch a Japanese version of the PSP game, which you have legally acquired, of course.
Obviously.
Yeah.
Goes without saying, but we'll say it.
Yeah, so if you've got the know-how to do something like that, that's probably the best way to play the game, but you will be playing a fan translation, so you know, caveats. This game sold 284,000 copies 285,000 copies worldwide. About 260,000 of those were in Japan. So it wasn't super great outside of Japan, to be honest, but probably still enough to make it worthwhile. The genre is the J-est of JRPGs. All of these, all Persona games are like really just like true Japanese role-playing games.
JRPGs. Okay.
Yeah. Takes about 48 and a half hours to beat if you're just playing through the story. So it's like, on the longer side of a JR of things, but not like ridiculous. We're not talking 120 hours like Persona 5 Royal or anything like that, but not super short either. Got an 83 on Metacritic, which is not bad. I think that's pretty high quality for fans of the series. Not really going to change anybody's mind if you're not into JRPGs, this one isn't going to do it for you. But if you are, it's pretty good. So it's got turn-based battles, takes place in Japan, and like I said, it doesn't get any more JRPG than that. So the gameplay follows the same paradigm as the first two games, mostly 2D sprite-based game that's viewed from kind of a pseudo 3D isometric perspective. So there's like some 3D effects happening, but most of the stuff in there is like 2D sprites. I think this makes sense because it is a straight sequel to the first Persona 2 game. So usually I think direct sequels have a similar like setup as the game before, except Final Fantasy X-2 did not. Final Fantasy X-2 was pretty different from Final Fantasy X, actually. Different battle system, different overall game structure. And then Final Fantasy 13-3 was just like a completely different game from the first two. So I guess it's not a given that a game would be the same just because it's a sequel. But anyway, Eternal Punishment is basically very similar. You can recruit personas to your roster. They're like monsters that sort of fight for you. They're in the story, they're like sort of reflections of your true self. And then you can fuse personas in the Velvet Room with Igor, which is very important to progression in the game, since personas that are the result of fusion are often much stronger than their base counterparts. And there's a whole sort of mini game in there of like determining which personas to fuse and what they turn into and how you get the good stuff. So there's a lot to do if you want to grind it out, I suppose. If you want to get like all the personas, you probably spend a lot more time than just 50 hours in the game.
Fusing, just all that fuse time.
Yeah, fusion. Yeah, it gets real weird. There's like a lot of just weird personas.
Does that fusing thing happen in other Persona games after this?
Yes. Yeah. Fusion is in, I think it's in all Persona games.
Okay.
I think it even goes back to the first one, if I recall correctly. I'm pretty sure it does. Yeah. So yeah, the story though is pretty different from its predecessor, but it is definitely a direct sequel. So there's going to be some spoilers here, especially for Persona 2 Innocent Sin, which you should play on PSP because it's really, really cool and really works well in that format, I think. Because I won't get too spoilery on Eternal Punishment storyline stuff, but it is important to know how Persona 2 Innocent Sin ends for the start of Eternal Punishment. So if you're planning on playing through these and you don't want story spoilers for either game, it's maybe just skip this one.
Maybe don't listen to this. It's okay. Tyler and I forgive you.
Or just skip ahead like 5-10 minutes when I'm done discussing the end of Innocent Sin.
But I think you can't listen to it at all.
Yeah.
You can't listen. You got to stop listening right now.
You probably still get spoiled for Innocent Sin even if you listen to later stuff.
It's my impression of a bad podcaster.
Don't listen to us.
Don't listen.
Don't listen. So yeah, anyway, at the end of Innocent Sin, as a quick recap, the end of Innocent Sin, which involves Hitler and a robot army, and that's not a joke. that's real. And of course, teenagers fighting God, also
classic
JRPG, especially Persona series. Every Persona game has teenagers fighting God in some form or another. Innocent Sin is definitely very unhinged. We've got Philemon, who is like sort of the like overall kind of god of Persona stuff. He's basically, he makes everybody forget the events of the first game in exchange for setting the world back to the way it was. So for their Innocent Sin, this new world of not remembering any of their adventures is sort of their eternal punishment. You get it? Because they got punished and
I gotcha.
So they forget each other. They forget all of their friendships, all of our buddies from Innocent Sin. Nobody knows each other anymore. It's very sad. But we do get a glimpse of Tatsuya, who is the main character of Innocent Sin. He's like the player character. He bumps into Maya Amano, who is also in Innocent Sin. She's like kind of an important journalist character, and she is our main protagonist in Persona 2 Eternal Punishment. And I think that makes her the only woman protagonist of a Persona game, unless you count Persona 3 Portable, which does give you the option of female male character. So,
really? I didn't know that.
Yeah. And they didn't do that for Persona 3 Reload, which is kind of a bummer, but also it requires a lot of story changes as well. To when you play the female main character in Persona 3, like it's pretty different. So anyway, so it's important to note that the original timeline of bad stuff that happened in Innocent Sin isn't gone. It's just a separate timeline called The Other Side, which is sort of important to the story later on. And that sort of feeds into this Persona theme that we see in every game of like dual worlds. Like there's like sort of the real world and then there's another world. The Other Side is like sort of that for this game. So you play as Maya Amano in Eternal Punishment, who is a journalist for a magazine called Coolest, which I think is a great name for a teen magazine. A lot of characters. Yeah. Because I want to be the coolest. As a teenager, I'm like, I want to be the coolest. Well, better read Coolest magazine,
Obviously. Yeah.
Yeah. A lot of characters from the previous game return as playable party members in this game, including Tatsuya Suo, who is the main protagonist of the first game. Not to be confused with Tatsuya Suduo with a D in the middle, who is kind of one of the bad guys in this game. You've also got Akichi, Lisa, and Jun. They're also here from Innocent Sin, but you cannot play as them, which is kind of a bummer.
No.
But, that's okay. It's sort of a different group of people, but same group of people too. Eternal Punishment brings back the theme of Kododama from the previous game. That's the belief that rumors can alter reality. We talked about it in the Innocent Sin episode, but also Matt in Japan gave us a good summary of that in our mailbag episode just one episode ago. So even if it is a little bit less popular with Japanese youths these days, it's still kind of there in the popular culture of Japan, and so Innocent Sin is based around it, with a rumors system in place that affects the events in the game, and that system sort of continues in Eternal Punishment. Persona 2 has an additional sort of things similar to Kododama, which is Kigari, which is much more of a religious thing, like a Shinto religious thing in Japan. So I suppose if you're not religious, you probably don't feel as strongly about this in Japan. I'm going to go to Wikipedia for the definition on this one because I am no expert on Japanese terms and their meanings. Maybe Matt in Japan can give us another lesson here. But
we're putting up the Matt signal.
Yeah, put up the Matt signal. We got to talk about Kigari. Which is, according to Wikipedia, is like it directly translates to like uncleanness or defilement. It is, and this is from Wikipedia, the Japanese term for a state of pollution and defilement, important particularly in Shinto as a religious term. And I think it's more of like a metaphorical state of pollution and defilement, although maybe there's some sort of like physical element there as well. But basically, you can like get Kigari, I don't know if that's the right way to put it, by coming into contact with death, childbirth, other similar things that are kind of considered unclean. So I'm going to quote from Wikipedia again, because I think this part is actually very important to note about Kigari. Kigari is not a form of moral judgment, but rather a spontaneous reaction to amoral natural forces, whether the defiling was caused by deliberate act, as for example, in the case of a crime, or by external events such as illness or death, is secondary, and therefore it is not the equivalent of sin. So it's not like you have failed somehow morally if you are afflicted with Kigari. It just is a thing that happens if you come in close contact with certain like unclean things, I guess.
Okay. So it happens to you. It's not.
It just sort of yeah. Okay. You try to avoid it, but if it does happen to you, nobody's going to be like mad at you about it, right?
Okay.
So it's not really something you're judged for, but it is something that can happen to you, and if it does, you need to like do something about it. It's sort of contagious in that it's thought that you can like bring it home to your families. Like if you go out and like deal with dead bodies and then come home, you can sort of bring that badness home. So it's important to take care of it if you think that you're in trouble here. It's kind of like the concept of like miasma in ancient Greece, where it's just like general like badness, like unclean badness, right? Which is maybe a term more of our listeners are familiar with. So it's like kind of like that. It's not exactly the same thing, but like kind of like that. So yeah, I'm not an expert on Japanese culture, especially Shinto religious Japanese culture. So if I messed any of this up, please send us an email, codexhistorypodcast@gmail.com. Set us straight. We will read it. So that's Kigari. It's kind of important to this game. I'm not going to get too deep into the story because I do think it's really cool, and I would like to avoid spoilers. But the basic premise is, again, everybody in Innocent Sin forgot the events of that game in order to set the world straight, except your boy Tatsuya. He remembered because, reasons. I don't know. Why not?
Mm-hmm.
In Eternal Punishment, there's another game that kids play that's similar to the game in Innocent Sin, where they summon Joker. Which is in Innocent Sin, they supposedly summon a Joker who can grant a wish. In this game, Joker is summoned by calling your own phone number, and he will assassinate somebody for you.
Wow, that
that's
escalates really quickly. Oh my goodness.
Yeah, it's kind of like a Death Note, I think. But you call them up instead of writing it down. So you call your own phone number, and then somebody will be assassinated for you. I don't know.
So if I call my own phone number, it usually goes to my voicemail, in which case I leave myself a voicemail, and then Joker comes and kills someone for me, right? That's how it works?
I think so, yeah.
Okay.
And because...
legit.
Yeah. Because of Kigari, anybody who has called the Joker and had them do a murder is now also a Joker. They just become a Joker. It's like a kind of an epidemic happening right now. We got a problem with Jokers being everywhere. This all comes into play later when the antagonists try to do some real stuff in this real weird stuff in the city to they want to raise the city up as a spaceship so that they can cleanse the earth of sin and then bring the city back down and live in this world free of sin. I guess I don't know. It gets into weird, but also standard JRPG territory.
Standard JRPG territory.
Yeah, fighting gods, saving the world. It's not quite as unhinged as the actual Hitler and robot Nazis, but it's pretty close. And I do like the story in this game. It also does have a cat who is a spy, and I'm pretty sure all cats are spies.
I would agree with that statement. I think Delilah's a spy. She's certainly sitting here, so she's probably listening to our conversation. Is Toby nearby?
No, he's locked out because he's a spy, and I don't want him.
And his espionage is he likes to turn off your computer for no reason. So
that's true. He does like to do that. He also likes to just generally be a nuisance, hopping up and
love that for him though.
He's a great cat. We love him. The story here also deals with standard Persona story stuff, like the characters discovering their true selves, summoning their personas to fight for them in battle. And that's kind of the biggest overarching theme that connects Persona games. They all kind of deal with different concepts, but the thing that connects them all together is this teenagers or young adults connecting with their true selves. And then that grants them great powers to solve their problems, which is probably a great metaphor for life. You want to be connected with your true self because that'll help you solve problems. This is actually the only Persona game that deals with adults because it's set a few years after the events of Eternal Innocent Sin, and the kids are all out of high school now. So it's kind of cool to see how they ended up as adults. Some of them go on to do cool stuff. Some of them don't go on to do cool stuff.
Makes me think about
bad guys.
It. Kind of reminds me of It, where they're kids and then they kind of do that bond thing after defeating Pennywise the first time or thinking they did, and then they come back as adults and they're like, oh, it's not gone, and they have to go back through again.
Yeah, it's kind of like that. They have to go back and sort of fix the problems that they caused the last time that they forgot about. So the writer of this game, Tadashi Satomi, he knew the team was going to have to make a sequel like this when they were writing Innocent Sin. As he's writing it, he's like, oh, we're going to have to tell another story from the perspective of somebody else. So that was cool that they realized that while they were making the first one, because it allowed them to do a lot of foreshadowing and introducing characters in the first game that would be important later on. Maya Amano is in the first game. She's there. She's not a huge character, and I don't think she's playable if I recall correctly. But then she's the main character of Eternal Punishment. So it's not a brand new character. If you played Innocent Sin, which if you were in North America, you did not. So that didn't mean anything to you. But it was great for Japanese audiences, I guess. They got to play all that stuff. This localization was much closer to the original Japanese, which is a stark contrast to Revelations Persona's localization, where they basically changed everything Japanese about that game in order to try to appeal to folks who live outside of Japan. Which it's hard to say if that was the right call or not back in the day, because I I don't know what the video game landscape was like back then. Like, were gamers turned off by obviously Japanese games? We don't know, but Atlas thought they would be, so they made it much more Japanese this time. So while Eternal Punishment is a direct sequel only to Innocent Sin, the first Persona game does have a few references and characters that show up towards the end in Eternal Punishment. It's like sort of like, hey, remember all the people getting the band back together? There's all these people from the first game too, which is pretty cool. And not really something that happens in later Persona games. I think these first 3 games, 1 and the 2 Persona 2 games, they're much more connected to each other story-wise. There are references to previous games in future Persona games, like indicating that they take place in the same like universe, but there isn't really a whole lot of interaction between characters, at least in the mainline games. Once you get into some of the spin-offs, then it gets real weird, and worlds collide. So yeah. The localization of Eternal Punishment did have to take into account the way that things were localized in Revelations Persona for that reason, because when they bring back characters, they want you to be familiar with those characters. So if they change the names of those characters to their more Japanese names, then you might not know who they're talking about. So they had to sort of keep some of that stuff around, but they did keep a lot of the Japanese stuff around this time. So it was a pretty good compromise, I think. So seeing those familiar things from Persona 1 in Persona 2 Eternal Punishment was pretty cool. But after Eternal Punishment, every Persona game, and I think Atlas like shifted as a company as well, all of those games released in North America would be much closer to their Japanese counterparts. So they'd take a much more direct approach to localization, mainly just translating dialogue while keeping all the amazing Japanese goodness that we love and expect from the series.
Yeah.
And this was like the first game that North American gamers got that really like celebrated the Japanese roots of the game, which is very cool.
Nice. Yeah.
So the release of this game is pretty strange in the world. Of course, both games got releases in Japan, and both games received excellent remakes on PSP in Japan as well. But Persona 2's journey outside of Japan is a little bit rockier, and we've touched on this earlier in the last episode and earlier in this episode, but I want to like sort of lay it out straight here. So the first game, Innocent Sin, never released outside Japan, but Eternal Punishment was. And this creates all kinds of weird story issues that we've talked about, because basically gamers were not just treated to only half the story, but the second half of the story. Like it's a bummer when you only get the first part of a story and then you never get the second part. Like that's a bummer, but at least you understand what's going on in the first part. This one, they just gave us the second half, so we didn't have the context necessary to like really understand what was going on here. The manual, like I said, manual covers the first game, and there's like a lengthy recap segment in the second game, like, but it's pretty far into the game where they sort of recap what happened in the first game. And so, you know, while I read the manual cover to cover of every game I ever bought on the car ride home, not everybody did that.
Yeah. So you might not know. It's such a weird choice for them to be like, we should release this one in the United States.
Yeah. Yeah, and there's reasons for that. There's like I don't know what the thought process was there, to be honest. But then you've got your PSP remakes, which are generally speaking the best way to play this game. Like the PlayStation games have a little bit of PlayStation jank going on. They're kind of hard to come by, I think, as well. And I think it's just generally easier to play the PSP versions. There's a lot of quality of life upgrades, things like that. So Innocent Sin saw its first release outside of Japan as this PSP remake in 2011, which is great because it's the first time people outside of Japan were able to play the game at all. And that version of the game is great. And at first, there were no plans to do the same for Eternal Punishment. But then eventually Atlas decided to release the game in 2012, sort of completing the series up to that point on PSP and PS Vita. So at that point in time, in 2012, after Eternal Punishment came out for PSP in Japan, you could play Persona 1, you could play Persona 2, both games, you could play Persona 3, all on your PSP. And if you had a PS Vita, you could also play Persona 4 Golden.
Wow, that's pretty
you could
cool.
play, yeah, and because PS Vita plays PSP games, if you had a PS Vita, you could play the entire Persona series portably up until Persona 5 came out. So this is all before Persona 5 came out. So you had the entire series on your PS Vita, which is pretty sweet.
Have we talked a lot about PSP and PS Vita? Because I feel like for handhelds, like I didn't have one, but I kind of want one now. Because I'm like, this is like a really cool handheld to have. I feel like the game library on PSP and PS Vita was pretty impressive for what you could play. Like playing these games portably is amazing. And it's also a great way to play them, I think, portably, because they're turn-based. They're not for like timing. It's not a big deal. Like playing them on a like a handheld is a good thing.
Yeah. I think and especially on PSP because you can put it to sleep and like you don't have to find a safe spot or anything. You just turn it off. Just don't let the battery run out while it's asleep. It'll run out in a couple of days, so be careful. But yeah, the PS Vita is very underrated, I think. And if you're into like the hacking scene of like jailbreaking your devices, the Vita is like a really really good one for that because it plays every PSP game, no problem. Plays every PlayStation 1 game, no problem. And then of course plays PS Vita games. There's tons of emulators for the PlayStation Vita. And even though the hardware on the PlayStation Vita is like over 10 years old now, it's 12, 13 years old now. It's still pretty good as far as like emulation goes. I think it does up to Nintendo 64 pretty well.
Ooh.
And it's got 2 joysticks on it. The screen, if you get one of the OLED screen ones, the original run, it's beautiful. It also streams games from your PlayStation 4 and 5. I think it does 5 as well. If it doesn't, there, I'm sure if you hack it, there are ways to make that work.
So they're still supporting it for 5s? That's really cool.
I don't know if it's officially supported or if that's like a thing that you have to do by hacking it. I'm not super deep into the PlayStation Vita scene, but I think there's ways to make it work if it doesn't work out of the box. So
nice.
I think that's pretty cool.
Yeah, well, that's our little tangent.
Yeah. Talk about the PS Vita.
Yeah.
So anyway, while folks outside of Japan finally got Innocent Sin in 2011, they never got that remake of Eternal Punishment. There are a few theories as to why this is, the most popular being that it was just the end of the life for PSP in 2013. It would have come out in 2013 outside of Japan, and the PS Vita was like alive and swinging in 2013, and maybe also kind of on its way down. That's the sad thing about the PS Vita, because it was really cool, but it was kind of like before. I don't want to say before its time. It's the opposite of, it was after its time. It was like kind of too little, too late, because phones, like smartphones, were really taking off at that point in time, and that's kind of what people used to play games when they were on mobile. So the PSP was like basically completely dead by this point, and even the PS Vita was like not doing super great. So that's kind of the leading theory as to like why they just didn't do Eternal Punishment, and then they were like, well, people got this game back in the day, so it just wasn't worth it, I guess. So we never got to play the remake of the only Persona 2 game that we had up until that point. So if you wanted to play both games, you had to play Innocent Sin on PSP and then Eternal Punishment on an old-timey PlayStation, though. They did give us a nice compromise, though, at this point in time, because the original PlayStation version of Eternal Punishment did see a release on the PlayStation Store for PSP, PS Vita, and PS3. So you could at least play it on modern hardware, even if it wasn't the cool new remake. You could still play the original PlayStation version.
That's
and
cool.
As far as I know, it's still available. So
I like that they did that. At least, like, even if you're not remaking it, just give me an option to play the original game.
Yeah,
that's cool.
Yeah, and I think that was a pretty easy lift for them, probably to just throw that in the little emulator shop, the PlayStation emulator shop. In 2022, though, fans released a fan translation of the PSP remake of Eternal Punishment, and I think that's probably the best way to play the game today. If you have the skills to acquire a legal copy, of course, rip it from your own PSP device in a totally legal way, of course. And then apply the translation patch to the game. This edition also includes some extra content that links the 2 Persona 2 games. That's not part of the translation. I mean, they did translate it, but that's just part of the Eternal Punishment remake. There's like some extra like linking content there. So that's worth checking out as well. So even if you played the PSP remake of Innocent Sin and then the PlayStation version of Eternal Punishment, there's some content you still missed out on that kind of links them together, which makes this version of the game worth playing even if you've played the originals. Yeah. So that's kind of all I have for Persona 2 Eternal Punishment. I think it's sort of just a neat continuation of Innocent Sin, the only real sequel in the Persona series, if you're not counting Persona 5 Strikers. It's worth checking it out for the history value. I think it's really cool that the PSP version has a fan translation. I love supporting like fan community projects that way. So when I get the chance to play a game that never got localized officially with a fan translation, I think that's really cool. It was the most successful Persona game in North America at the time, which was great and probably a good reason why we started getting more Shin Megami Tensei games over here. Like Shin Megami Tensei 3 Nocturne came out on PS2 in the US, and then further Persona games, of course. These days we get everything Persona, and often and more recently it comes out at the exact same time worldwide, which is really cool too. And I think we got to give Eternal Punishment a little bit of credit for getting that ship moving in that direction. So
I think so too.
I think for that reason alone, making sure that we get everything Shin Megami Tensei afterwards, or not everything, but most things, and is pretty admirable, and I think it's a cool game for that. So, but most of the credit for popularizing Persona in outside of Japan, or at least in North America, goes to Persona 3, which we will cover another time on the show. I'm really excited for that one because coming into this series, I was not super familiar with Persona 1 or both Persona 2 games. Persona 3, I am very familiar with. Persona 4, I love. Persona 5, so we're getting into some good territory. That's why I wanted to make sure we covered Eternal Punishment here, was so that we didn't have like a hole in our Persona series of episodes, because I'm excited to cover 3, 4, and 5.
We're getting into the big ones. These are the popular Personas, the ones that everyone's like, this is it. This is the game that made it what it is today.
Yeah, exactly. And like Persona 3 is the first one that does like social links, which is basically inseparable from the Persona series at this point, but was not really a thing before Persona 3. So
High School Simulator.
High School Simulator, very important. I'm stoked to get into these games, so we'll get to that in a future episode. But Mike, what you been playing?
Ooh, well, I have Hell Dove a little bit this week. I've kind of pulled away a little bit. I haven't played it as much, mostly because patch 1.6 for Stardew Valley came out, and I bought it on another platform sale. I now have Stardew Valley on mobile, Switch. I have a physical copy on Switch that I've never used. I just own it because I wanted it. And then I bought the Steam version on sale this week so I could play the 1.6 patch. And then I also have it on Game Pass that I could play. Like most of my saves are on Game Pass. If I'm being completely honest, the mobile version of the game is fine. I just think the control scheme is really hard to use. And if I'm going to play it on mobile, I might as well just bring my Switch with me. That's kind of how I'm feeling. But I love it so far. I did the Riverlands farm. It's not the new farm. The new farm's called the Meadowlands farm, and it's more livestock focused. And I've already am wondering if I'm going to ditch this new save that I put like 5 hours in and just start a Meadowlands farm. I love it. I love Stardew Valley. It's like I go through phases where I go back into it again, and I've never perfected it. Like I've never gotten 100% completion on it. Might do that, or go for perfection and see what happens. But I'm not sure. I'm just digging the game, and it's a vibe, and it feels good, and I like it, and it's the kind of game I need right now. I feel like I want a cozy game that doesn't mean much after playing so many like intense games. Because Helldivers 2, I've been playing it on Helldive difficulty. It gets intense, and
is that the hardest difficulty?
That's the hardest difficulty. That's how I've been playing it, or like Impossible or Helldive at least. Those are the last two, 8 and 9. Because you get the super samples and stuff that way, and it's fun, but it's kind of like Doom Eternal. When you're done, you're like, whew, I'm like sweating a little bit. Like I was like, putting a lot of effort into it. So I just kind of wanted a little break from that, and Stardew Valley is hitting hard. Also binging the Alien movies for a side note. I decided because I saw the new trailer for Alien Romulus, I think is what it's called. And I was like, it's been a long time since I've watched all the Alien movies. And so I just started from the beginning, and I'm on Alien 3. And this is the beginning of the end of the weird and terrible movies for Alien.
The first 2 are pretty good, as I understand it. After that, it gets pretty dicey.
First one of the best horror movies of all time. Second one, a fun 80s action movie. Third one, they make some choices at the very beginning that you're like, what are you doing? And I'm in the middle of it, and I'm just like, what's happening right now? But I want to watch them all. I don't know if I'm going to include Alien versus Predator or Predator. I might just watch the Alien movies. I've heard I need to watch Prey, though. That's like the newest Predator movie, and apparently it's very good. So I want to watch that. But Tyler, what you been playing?
I'm still all about Final Fantasy VII Rebirth. I'm 40 hours in. I just made it to Cosmo Canyon. I've sort of given up on the like trying to 100% every region as I move through. I did the first couple regions. I 100% of them. It takes a long time. And I'm getting antsy for the story. I just want to see where it goes, and I think I'm getting to be towards the end
of the whole game.
Yeah.
Is it shorter? Is it like, well, it is shorter because it's cut up Final Fantasy VII into bits, right? That's what they're doing with it.
But it's not shorter than Final Fantasy VII. Rebirth itself is longer than the original game.
Oh, okay. Can you lay it out to me? What's going on? So the first Final Fantasy VII remake came out a couple years ago, right?
4 years ago, 2020.
Okay, and that was all of the original game or part of the original game?
Just part of it. It was the first part of in 7. You spend a lot of time in Midgar, the main city, and then there's a point where you leave Midgar and like the whole world opens up. It's a very cool moment. In Final Fantasy VII, that moment is like 6 to 10 hours in, depending on how completionist you are. Like that's how long it is. Final Fantasy VII Remake, which is just that first portion, is probably 25 or 30 hours of that content. They add storylines, they change details of stuff, but there's just a lot more character development for most of the characters. There are a few characters that are kind of just side characters in the original that get full arcs in Remake, which is really cool. And then so you get to the end of Remake, you go outside of Midgard, there's this whole world, and then it's like, okay, see you in 4 years for the next one. And then Rebirth picks up right from that point, and takes us through kind of the second third of the length of the story. But again, it's very expanded, lots of new storyline stuff. There's like 8,000 mini games in this. There's open worlds, so of course there's just time spent running around open worlds. So if the original Final Fantasy VII is like 40 or 50 hours to get through, if you're like doing the storyline and some of the side quest stuff, I would say the whole of all of the Final Fantasy VII remake stuff is going to end up being maybe 100 hours.
Wow. Okay. So you're in this is really like part 2 of 3 is what Rebirth is. Okay.
Yes. But I think there is kind of a misconception about them in that it's like, oh, they just split the game up into 3 games. They're going to try to sell it to me 3 times. While that's true from a story perspective,
stretched.
Yes. There's so much story stuff added to the game that makes it worthwhile. Like you don't feel like they just stretched this out and they're just making me do filler content for 10 extra hours. It's like there's a lot of good story stuff there. So nice. It's worthwhile. I don't think there's anything disingenuous about it. If we were to wait 10 years for them to remake the entire thing, it would be 150 hours. And I mean, I guess there are games that do that are that long, but they are not to the production quality that 7 Remake and Rebirth are. Like games that are actually 150 hours long, there's a lot of just like not voiced content. There's a lot of just like story sequences that are just mashing through dialogue, right? There's none of that in this. Like everything is fully voice acted. Everything, like every good like story beat gets full cutscene treatment. Like they're really going hard. There's tons of mini games. There's like all kinds of side content to do too. So I think they're worthwhile, although I am a Final Fantasy fanboy. So, you know,
do you think I should play the original Final Fantasy VII before I play these ones?
There is kind of a thing going on in these new games where we have they make some changes to the storyline, but then there's like an entity in the game that is sort of trying to make that not happen. They like show up at opportune times to like nudge the story back in the direction that the original game went. So
there's like a subplot going on about this being like there's a meta thing going on. You're saying,
yes, yeah,
okay.
It's like so in that sense, it's like kind of a sequel. I wouldn't say that like, oh, if you haven't played the first one, you're just lost. You're like you have no idea what's happening. I would say if you haven't played the first one, there's just a lot of references that you'll miss. That is fine. The games are great. I think on their own they're great. The original is kind of hard to go back to at this point because it's old and the graphics are not great, and there's just a lot of like quality of life stuff that more recent JRPGs will have given you. So
is it going to give me flashbacks to when we played the first Kingdom Hearts, where we're just like, what is happening right now? Why won't you let me do things that I can do in the normal video games?
Yeah, it's even worse than that because it's
okay.
It's the first like 3D Final Fantasy game on a PlayStation, and so yeah, it hasn't aged super well. Although if you want to play it, like it hasn't aged terribly either. It's just if you're interested, I think play Remake first, and if the story is something that you're into and that you think is really cool, if it's grabbing you, yeah, then I think after you've made your way through Remake and Rebirth, go back and play the original and like sort of compare it. And like that's a fun way to do it too, I think, because most of the people going into these two games have played the original and are like making comparisons in that direction. Like, I would love to hear what somebody who's making comparisons in the other direction thinks, you know?
Well, here is my thought, because we talk about, like, you've played all the Call of Duty games. You're like going through all the Call of Duty games, right? Yeah. I was like, do I go through every Final Fantasy game? Do I try? That's a big ask. So I was thinking, because I also need to do Metal Gear for you. So I'm like, Metal Gear probably should come first. Metal Gear Solid, because that's a little bit more reasonable of a request.
Yeah, they're also not as long. Like Final Fantasy games are long.
Yeah, especially when you get into like the later ones, they get real long. Like, yeah, because like I feel like 1, 2, and 3, since they were on Nintendo and they were kind of limited by space and memory issues, they're like 30 or 40 hours. They're not
even that long. They're like,
oh really?
They're like 20.
Oh, okay. They're not even that. So okay, so then that's not too bad. But like the other ones, I'm like, maybe it's gonna get a little crazy if I try to marathon those. So
yeah, I'll definitely 6 gets pretty long. 7. They just kind of start to get longer. 13's not that long. 12's pretty long. But yeah, they are much more of a commitment. Whereas the Metal Gear Solid games are like, if you're really putting in the time, you can get them done in a couple of nights.
Nice. Okay. Yeah. Well, in that case, maybe we'll do just Metal Gear Solid first and try this out. I'm waiting because I want to get like a streaming setup going so we could do it together and I could be on a stream. I thought that'd be kind of nice and fun.
Yeah.
So that's kind of the idea. But all right. Well, that sounds great. I'm happy for you. I'm happy you're in it. You know, I don't see you as often as I used to. I'm not going to lie, listener. I don't see Tyler most of the time. I only really see Tyler on Sundays when we record. But that's
just
okay.
Too sucked into.
But he's just he's lost. He's lost in a Final Fantasy, and I understand that, and we respect it. We're fine. Okay. But yeah. So with that, though, that's the episode today. We did it. We did a great job. You did a great job. It was mostly you. I just kind of was here. I was just chilling, you know, and it felt nice to learn about this crazy, zany world of Persona 2. But things you can do to support us. You can go to codexpodcast.net. That is our website. It's got all of our links on there. Our Discord is a contact form. You can email us if you want directly at codexhistorypodcast@gmail.com. Other than that, Tyler, would you like to say goodbye to everyone?
Goodbye to everyone.